Emmerdale spoilers for Thursday, the 24th of July tease that secrets are on the verge of shattering the village's long-standing peace, with familiar faces walking straight into danger without even realizing. Paddy, who is quietly trying to piece his life back together after a series of emotional upheavals, finds himself closer than ever to uncovering a truth that could tear them all apart. It began with an opportunity, simple, unassuming, yet timely. Paddy stumbled across a job offer that seemed tailor-made for his skill set and temperament. It wasn't grandiose, just a role that involved working closely with animals in a private capacity, and it gave him a sense of purpose that had long been missing. He shared the news with Marlon, his ever-faithful confidant, and their conversation was laced with a rare sense of hope. Paddy even joked that his very first client was something of a mystery, a quiet, guarded man with a dog that seemed more anxious than aggressive. What he didn't know was that this client, John, held a secret that could upend the lives of many. John had been keeping a low profile in the village, often seen but seldom remembered. He moved with care, spoke little, and observed everything. But now, he found himself torn. The pressure was mounting. His involvement in something dark, something he believed he had outrun, was beginning to catch up to him. After a few sleepless nights, he debated calling someone for help. He almost dialed Paddy, hesitated, and ultimately didn't. It wasn't fear of betrayal. It was the familiarity in Paddy's voice that triggered something buried deep. Was it recognition? Guilt? Still uncertain, John shifted his attention to Robert. He suspected Robert had been digging too deep, asking questions he shouldn't. And so, John did what he thought necessary: he planted a listening device. The irony was bitter. The man searching for truth was now feeding it directly to the one hiding it. When he finally gathered the courage to call Paddy, the line rang, and just as Paddy picked up and spoke, John froze. The voice struck him. There was something dangerously familiar. Fear gripped him, and without saying a word, he ended the call. Paddy sat there, confused and disappointed. He had been genuinely intrigued by the client. Something about him felt unfinished, like there was a story begging to be told. But now, all he had was silence, and a strange unease curling in his chest. Elsewhere in the village, Cain Dingle was on his own warpath. The death of Nate had shattered something inside him, and he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. He and Tracy sat hunched over the kitchen table, scouring memories, piecing together timelines, trying to form a list of people who could have possibly done it. Cain, methodical yet emotionally volatile, began eliminating names: good people, bad people, those who were too weak, or too scared. But one name stubbornly remained: John. Before Cain could act on this suspicion, the police arrived with a revelation. A letter from Owen had surfaced. Cain barely heard the words, but he felt them. They struck like knives. Tracy collapsed into grief once again, but Cain. He wouldn't, accept that Owen had killed Nate. Not his friend. Not like this. Unable to sit still, Cain paid a visit to Liam. Owen, after all, had once been Liam's patient. Perhaps he had seen something, some warning sign. But Liam, true to his code, refused to breach patient confidentiality. Pain like yours, he told Cain, makes monsters of all of us. But Cain saw it as a wall. Another dead end. But John was watching. And John's hands were shaking. He saw Cain's fury and Tracy's sorrow, and for the first time in a long while, he was scared, not of being caught, but of the consequences of staying hidden. So, trembling, he made the call to Paddy. He hoped for mercy. But when the call connected, and the sound of Paddy's voice crackled through, his panic surged. That voice. He knew it. Not from the present, but from a moment long buried. He hung up. Meanwhile, Robert was circling. His own intuition screamed that John wasn't who he claimed to be. When he confided this to Chuz, she brushed it off as envy. "You're just mad he got there before you did," she teased, referring to a small rivalry over a recent business prospect. But Chuz noticed Kane's reaction. Silent. Dark. Reflective. And suddenly, even she couldn't deny that something was off. Kane wasn't speaking, but he was connecting dots. John's sudden appearance, the strange air around him, the unease that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He remembered Nate's final weeks, the odd calls, the quiet arguments, the moments Nate seemed to be guarding a secret of his own. And then there was Owen, the note, the confusion, the guilt. All of it began to collapse into something tangible. And Kane's eyes darkened. As Kane wrestled with this storm, another blew through unexpectedly. Moira was arrested. The accusation: involvement in the break-in and destruction of their farm. She'd always suspected Joe was behind it. A vendetta, perhaps, after refusing to sell their land to Kim. But when the investigators confirmed that Joe had an alibi and was cleared of any involvement, the fear hit Moira like a punch. She could be going to prison. And this time, there was no convenient enemy to pin the blame on. The Dingles were crumbling under pressure. Paddy's instincts told him the answer was near. Kane's vengeance threatened to ignite a wildfire. And John was inching toward exposure, teetering on the edge of the truth, hoping to be pulled back before it was too late. The village, serene on the outside, was about to detonate from within. John paced back and forth in the dim confines of his cottage. The air was thick with tension, his chest tight with dread. The failed phone call with Paddy lingered in his mind, like a wound that refused to close. He knew that moment of hesitation had cost him something, possibly everything. But worse than being found out was the unraveling of his own sanity. Each time he heard voices from outside, footsteps near his door, or even a dog's bark in the distance, he jumped. Fear had overtaken his survival instinct. Across the village, Paddy remained restless. Though the day's duties kept him occupied, his mind replayed the strange interaction. The man he had spoken with, John, had the voice of someone with a buried past. Paddy wasn't sure why, but something about it stirred a memory. Faint. Fuzzy. But important. He mentioned it again to Marlon, who only raised an eyebrow, but Paddy couldn't shake the sensation. What if this wasn't just a nervous client? What if this man was dangerous? Kane, meanwhile, had begun digging deeper on his own. Distrust had become second nature, and the way John's name kept surfacing made his instincts roar. While Tracy remained paralyzed in grief over Nate, Kane transformed his heartbreak into investigation. He returned to the list they had compiled and began asking around about John. Where had he come from? Who knew him? The answers were vague, inconsistent. He had no family, few friends, and no history anyone could confirm. The gaps in John's identity spoke louder than words. Kane's next move was calculated. He decided to confront John. But he wouldn't make his presence known outright. Instead, he watched, lurking near John's home late at night, parked in his car, lights off, engine cut. He observed John's routine, his paranoia. He watched how John checked the locks on his door 4 times each evening, how he refused to linger in public spaces. Kane didn't know exactly what he was seeing, but he knew one thing: guilt had a shape, and it looked like John. John wasn't oblivious. He'd sensed Kane's presence on more than one occasion. Every time he heard the low hum of an engine or saw a silhouette in the shadows, his pulse spiked. The village, once his sanctuary, was closing in on him. And so, for the second time, he considered reaching out to Paddy. Not for exposure, but for help. Someone with compassion. But the fear of recognition held him back again. He couldn't afford for Paddy, or anyone, to remember who he was. As if the air weren't heavy enough, another shock hit the village. The police returned, this time with forensic updates from Nate's murder scene. Traces of a rare chemical compound had been found, one not commonly accessible. Kane's eyes widened. He remembered the same substance being used years ago, in a veterinary case Paddy had once handled. That connection, no matter how thin, forced Paddy deeper into the orbit of the investigation. Kane brought the information to Paddy, hoping to understand more. But the moment he mentioned the substance, Paddy froze. That's when the memory returned. He had treated a similar case for a man years ago, under a false name. And the voice from that old case. It matched John's. Paddy said nothing in front of Kane. But that night, he pulled out his old notes, dug through archived records, and found the case. It was incomplete. The man had paid in cash. Left no name, no ID, but the handwriting on the consent form matched the receipt John had signed recently. Paddy now had more than suspicion, he had a lead. John, realizing how quickly the walls were closing in, contacted Robert, claiming he had information about Owen's final days. He requested a private meeting at night in the woods near the river. It was a gamble, but John knew Robert couldn't resist. If Robert believed John had answers, he'd come. And he did. Their meeting was tense. John, cloaked in the shadows, spun a story about overhearing Owen confess regrets, about feeling cornered by something. Or someone. But Robert wasn't naive. As John spoke, Robert noticed inconsistencies. Names swapped. Dates misaligned. And the way John avoided eye contact sent up red flags. As the conversation ended, Robert made a decision. He would talk to Chuz again. When he returned, he laid out everything. His concerns, the story John had told, and his belief that John wasn't just hiding, he was manipulating. Chuz, still reluctant to side with Robert fully, nonetheless began to take his words more seriously. She remembered small things, John's reluctance to talk, the strange intensity in his eyes, the awkward silences when others mentioned Nate. At the Dingle house, Kane had reached his breaking point. Moira's legal trouble worsened as investigators found fibers from the farm storage room at the scene of the break-in. She swore she hadn't been there. Kane believed her, but believing didn't free her. Desperation clawed at him. He needed a name. A face. Someone to blame. And all signs kept pointing to John. That night, Paddy returned to John's home under the guise of a routine checkup on the dog. But this time, he asked questions, not about the animal, but about John himself. Where he came from. Why he looked so tired. And then, deliberately, Paddy asked about Owen. The reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. John flinched. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. He tried to play it off, said he didn't know him well. But Paddy saw it. The crack in the facade. Later that evening, John called someone. Not Paddy. Not Robert. But a woman. His voice trembled as he begged her to leave the city, to forget about him. He said he was too far in, that they were getting closer. He didn't say names. Just begged, again and again, until the line went dead. Paddy, meanwhile, visited Marlon and laid everything out. The voice match. The old case. The weird inconsistencies. For once, Marlon didn't crack a joke. He only said, "You have to tell someone." But Paddy wasn't ready to go to the police. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to be sure. And so, he returned to the property records office and pulled John's rental agreement. As expected, It was under a fake name. But tucked in the folder was a shipping receipt for dog medication ordered online, and it listed an address from years ago. An address tied to a criminal case Paddy remembered from the news. A man who had disappeared after being linked to a murder investigation in Leeds. The suspect's name had been cleared later due to lack of evidence. But his face was John's. Meanwhile, Kane had broken into John's shed. What he found inside confirmed his worst fears: tools, rope, gloves, and detailed sketches of farm layouts, including their own. John had been planning something, or had already done it. Kane took photos and stormed to the police. With multiple reports coming in, Robert's concerns, Kane's evidence, and Paddy's findings, the police finally began their formal investigation. But John was already gone. That morning, his house stood empty. The dog left behind. No note. No forwarding address. Just silence. And somewhere, in a different part of Yorkshire, a man boarded a train under a new name. Behind him, Emmerdale was beginning to heal, but the scars John left behind would take a long time to fade.